Let me know when should I start.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the AutoKids Journal Club. Chinmay has fetched out some papers from JPO 16, 17, and 18. And typically, we have few papers. And then we have two experts today, Dr. Mandar Agashe from Mumbai. Mandar is a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, and as you might all be aware, that he is the chief reviewer and one of the editors of Indian Journal of Orthopedics Pediatrics section, and he is going to talk about uh, how he wrote his first paper and what we should keep in mind. And then we have Jayan Sampath from Bangalore. He's a renowned pediatric orthopedic surgeon, and he is the chief editor of International Journal of Pediatric Orthopedics, which is the official journal of Pediatric Orthopedic Society India. And Jayant has fortune or misfortune to go through many manuscripts written by young authors of India, and he will give us his wisdom how to write papers. So I'll invite Gaurav to start the ball rolling by reading the first paper. Gaurav, please.
Yeah, so I hope I'm audible to everyone and my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just start. So this is a paper titled Slipped Capital Femoral
हाँ
Epiphysis
मंदार.
in Children Younger than 10 years old, Clinical Characteristics and Efficacy of Physial Sparing Procedures. This paper is from Korea and was published in JPOB 2017. So we all know that slipped capital femoral epiphysis is gradual displacement of femoral neck and shaft relative to the femoral head in an anterolateral direction and is most commonly seen in peripubertal period with an average age of 13.5 years in boys and around 12 years in girls. And in situ screw fixation for mild to moderate slips is the most commonly used treatment as it closes the physis and prevents further slippage. But along with that, it also leads to premature physial closure and interferes with remodeling of the deformed proximal femur. Skiffy in patients less than 10 years is rare and is known as an early skiffy, and these patients are more likely to have obesity, endocrine and metabolic disorders. They also have a high risk of developing contralateral skiffy, and using a in situ screw can lead to early physial closure in this age group and can cause significant limb length discrepancy along with persistent deformation of the proximal femur causing femoroacetabular impingement. So aim of the study was to investigate the clinical characteristics of early onset skiffy and identify the efficacy of physial sparing procedures in this age group. It's a retrospective study done on skiffy patients treated from February 1992 to August 2011. Patients diagnosed with skiffy and followed up until closure of the proximal femoral physis were included in the study, whereas those who received treatment in other hospitals before referral and those who were aged 16 years or older were excluded. So there were around 89 patients, including 75 boys and 14 girls, and out of these 18 were less than 10 years, including two bilateral, and 71 were more than 10 years. In less than 10-year kids, they did physial sparing procedures in 5. They started physial sparing procedures after 2005 and did in 5 patients, whereas 13 patients were fixed with a the physial fixation or in situ screw was fixed. In physial sparing procedures, they used three methods. One where they used Steinman pins as were used in modified Wagner procedure. Another where they used a smooth tipped screw where they destroyed the threads and made it smooth. And the third was a long screw with a short threaded tip to prevent physial damage and allow continuous growth at the physis. So these were the 5 patients less than 10 years where they used physial sparing procedures. All were male, and most of them have moderate to mild slip. None of them had a severe slip. All were obese. And we'll talk about the results later. But most of them required, they used long screw with a short threaded tip in 3 patients, smooth tipped screw in one, and Steinman pins in one. And this is the comparison between all skiffy patients less than 10 years where they use sparing and fixation techniques. In 5 patients they used sparing physical sparing technique, whereas in 13 they used they did physical fixation. uh, in physical sparing group all were obese, whereas in physical fixation there were few overweight and normal kids also. All were stable slips in physical sparing group, whereas one was unstable, but it is not significant. And there was none of the patients in physical sparing group had a severe slip, whereas 2 patients in physical fixation group had a severe slip. And these were the comparison between kids less than 10 years and more than 10 years. So these were also not significant. I mean, the groups were comparable. And now let's talk about the results. So they calculated femoral neck length, which was calculated as a distance between the center of the femoral head and the point of intersection of the femoral shaft and the femoral neck at the intertrochanteric line. And they measured it before and at final follow up, and they found that the lengths were comparable in both the sides in a physical sparing group, whereas there was a huge difference between the affected and unaffected side in the physical fixation group. They also calculated the articulotrochanteric distance, which was defined as the distance between the tip of the greater trochanter to the top of the femoral head along the femoral shaft axis, and they found that they were comparable in the affected and unaffected side in the physical sparing group, whereas there was a significant difference in the affected and unaffected side in the physical fixation subgroup. They also calculated the alpha angle and femoral head neck offset. Alpha angle was defined as the angle formed by line between the femoral head neck junction and the center of the femoral head, and the axis of the femoral neck passing through the center of the head. And femoral head neck offset was the distance between the widest point of the femoral head and the most prominent point of the femoral neck. And they found that between the in the physical sparing group, the uh, they were comparable between the affected and unaffected side at final follow up, but there was a huge difference between the affected and the unaffected side in the physical fixation group, suggesting minimal remodeling in the physical fixation group. Also, they calculated the slip angle and they classified mild, moderate, severe on the basis of Southwick's angle. And they found that there was a significant change or decrease in the slip angle in the physical sparing subgroup, but not much in the physical fixation group. They compared their study with previous studies using physical sparing techniques where people use smooth tipped screws or long screws with a short threaded tip, Steinman pins. They didn't use LIH pin, uh, and they found that all the studies had shown significant remodeling, continued growth, and epiphyseal stability in majority of cases using physical sparing uh, technique. Most of these techniques suggested growing away phenomena and repeated use of screws while using physical sparing technique, and they also found the same. So the drawback of physical sparing procedure is that implant repeated and frequent implant change is required. In their study, out of 5 kids, 4 required repeated implant change, and 2 patients required 3 times and 2 times change of the screw. as proximal femur grows out of it. And they they also suggested that physical sparing procedures may have less purchase and stability than in situ screw fixation, leading to a potential risk of loss of fixation and further slippage, and thus they restrict themselves to this procedure in less than 10 years and only in mild and moderate slips and not the severe ones. Limitation of this study was that it's a retrospective study with a very small sample size and a heterogeneous surgical procedure, and there was a difference in the severity of slip between physical sparing and physical fixation subgroups, as two cases in physical fixation were of severe slip, whereas none of the cases had severe slip in physical sparing procedure. Due to this scarce number, there's no statistical significance. So, on the basis of their study, they recommend a long screw with a short threaded tip should be used if physical sparing technique is used, and this screw should be left around 1 to 1.5 centimeters longer from the lateral cortex, so that with growth, this screw can be sucked in by the epiphysis, and thus screw changes can be decreased. And they limit their physical sparing procedures only to stable skiffes. To conclude, they concluded that obesity is associated more with skiffy in patients less than 10 years. Physical sparing procedures are an attractive option to prevent limb length discrepancy and enhance remodeling of the deformed proximal femur in younger patients with stable skiffy. And stabilization of the physis using a long screw with a short threaded tip is the preferred procedure of these techniques. One thing I
Fine.
forgot to tell is that they also calculated the limb length discrepancy and found that none of the patients had a significant limb length discrepancy in the physical sparing procedure, whereas more than five kids had more than 2 centimeters of limb length discrepancy in the physical fixation group. So,
Fine, Gaurav. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's already 12 minutes. So yeah, you want to just glance through your slides
Yeah, so
quickly?
but just one point, that how it can be used in our practices, as I did this procedure in a 12-year-old child 2 years back, and now this is the 2-year follow-up showing a significantly decreased neck length and a significant change in articulotrochanteric distance and a good remodeling with a screw fixation. As we can see from this X-ray, there's a significant remodeling in the neck at junction. But then, uh, this is a 12-year-old child, and there is a significant difference in the proximal femur anatomy, but the child has no complaints. So, yes, this study tells us that this can be used in a this should be used in smaller kids, but then I don't know how people will take it as a repeated change of implant in our practice. So that is skeptical.
Okay. Yeah. So it's nice review of the paper. Now, question is, were they how they differentiated whether it's a Delbey type 1 injury or a SCFE? Does the paper mention that this was a slip, a gradual slip, or it was an acute injury? Is there any
So,
mention of this?
no. So there is no mention about whether it's a skiffy or it's a Delbey injury. They have diagnosed it as skiffy. They have mentioned that it's a skiffy, uh, and they use these two techniques. They just classified it as moderate, mild, or severe skiffy. That's all, on
बियर
the
निक
basis of Southwick's angle.
बियर निकल रहा है क्या अंदर से? Okay.
नहीं नहीं
Another paper, another
सर.
thing is in severe slips, they have done in situ fixation,
Yeah.
and they have seen a high complication. And again, if you see in a severe slip, the neck length, the ATD, all they are going to get worsen. So there are very small number, only 5 patients, and so there are many variables they have used, different radiological parameters on only on 5 patients. So this is a very poor study, I would say. although it is very rare to see young patients with real SCFE, but then if you try to do multiple statistical analysis, so that is not good stat analysis. The power of study is not good, very small number of patients. So to make good conclusion out of this is a problem. I think that those are the limitations of this paper. Yes, I'll ask Jayant what is his view about this paper.
So it's an excellent strategy in terms of publication. When you have only 5 patients, you can start with 89 patients, right? That's the way to write a paper. So you don't say I have 5 patients in my study. You say that I have 89 patients in my study, and then you gradually whittle it down to 5, right?
Yeah.
So that is one good message from this paper, and it's more likely to get accepted if you write papers like this. This the technique that these people have advocated has been done on much larger numbers of patients in other papers. There's one paper from the UK where they've used this short threaded screw with leaving the we're leaving the extra osseous part of the screw longer, so that as the physis grows, the screw enters into the bone. And then when the screw head touches the cortex, you change it. The advantage with that compared to the other two techniques is that you gradually lose fixation with the smooth. When you have a smooth threaded tip, or if you use smooth stymie pins, you gradually lose the fixation as the physis grows away from the implant.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but there are studies with much larger numbers of patients with the same technique, with this short threaded tip technique, that clearly shows the same result. So the conclusions of the paper are valid, but not from this paper. But so the message is, I think we should start to use this technique, even though it seems quite odd for, as an orthopedic surgeon, for us to leave 2 centimeters of the screw outside the bone, but we just need to tell the parents that this is a deliberate thing that we are doing. And even the other paper from the UK, I think they had some maybe 30 or 40 patients, and they showed that the same is that the alpha angle changes, and that there is much, you have fewer problems with femoral stability.
Yeah.
So the conclusions are valid.
Fine. So, Jayant, we'll be grateful if you can share that paper with us, and I'll share with the
Sure.
fellows.
Yeah.
I think there was a paper from Sweden, and where they have used this smooth shank in the front, and they had similar conclusion. They required repetitions, but the growth was good. I remember then sick kids, they tend to fix it with the screws, and they would deal with the limb length discrepancy later with contralateral epiphysiodesis. But loosening of the fixation, and some of the patients where the screw will become short of physis, that will become a stress riser, because this patient are still to reach near puberty. So those patients, there were some incidents that they slip from the screw end. Yeah, so that acts as a stress riser. So besides using that, they would use a simple screw and deal with the contralateral epiphysiodesis for the younger children around 8-9 years. When it comes to 5-6 years, still people would fix with wires and bring the wires off.
That's
Okay.
that's the one more relevant point is, if you're doing femoral neck fixation, don't leave the tips of the screws just at the physial level. So there is a known problem where after femoral neck fixation, satisfactory femoral neck fixation, so either you leave it well short of the physis, or if you're going to end up at the physis with the screw tip, cross the physis, because then you get a slip, and it becomes a problem if you do that. So it's just an observation, because we are in that area. I'm just saying.
Perfect. I think we should proceed to the next paper. Gaurav, can you stop sharing your screen? Thank you very much. And who is next? Is it Chinmay or Shalin?
I just had a question. From the senior faculty, that how many early slips you people have seen less than 10 years? So I have not seen any till now.
I have about half a dozen patients whom I'm following up. This is over a 10-year period. I've accumulated half a dozen patients. And they all follow me throughout all the hospitals. Wherever I go, they come along with me. So it's like a caravan so I have about 6 patients in 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's probably one a year. But I have more numbers now. For the first 3 or 4 years, like you, Gaurav, I had no patience. So you'll start accumulating them now.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're on the right track. You're on the curve.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So due to the endocrine people sitting in the adjacent room, I see a few patients, but I have not seen this young 6.5, 7 years. I don't remember I had any. Yes, Chinmay, go ahead.
Yes. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, and Mandar is here, so he'll be able to help with this paper. Go ahead.
Good morning, all. Myself, Dr. Chinmay. I'm presenting a paper from JPOB by Dr. Baran Sarakia from Turkey. The paper is about the early radiological effect of Deca and Pemberton osteotomies on hip development in children aged 4 to 8 years with developmental dysplasia of a hip. So first about the background of this paper, as we all pediatric orthopedic surgeon, when the patient with when the DDS patient with the walking abilities come to us, we have the three most common questions in our mind: the age of the patient when we intervene this patient, the type of osteotomy for the acetabulum to coverage of the femoral head, that is Deca and Pemberton, and how this Deca and Pemberton will on long-term follow-up will behave. Taking consideration into this background, the aim of the current study is to investigate the early radiological changes in hips age 4 to 8 years for which open reduction was performed together with either Deca or Pemberton osteotomy. In material and method, total 76 hips were included in this study, out of which 39 are Pemberton and 37 were Degas. All the procedures was done by the single surgeon, and the study was conducted between 2007 to 2011. All the surgical procedure standard procedure by open reduction by anterior Bickney incision, and for femoral osteotomy lateral incision were taken. And in Pemberton osteotomy, mean age was 54 months and mean follow-up up to is 22 months. In Deca, the mean age is 83 months and mean follow-up is up to 26 months. The functional outcome and radiological parameter will assessed by the acetabular index, acetabular depth ratio, center edge of angle, and Reimer index. Functional outcome assessment was done by the Severin group, and the complication were assessed by the Kalmachi group. Speaking about the results, in a Pemberton and Deca, acetabular index and acetabular depth ratio didn't show any significant difference. But if they compare within the group, there is in Pemberton there is 81% improvement in the acetabular depth ratio, and in Deca there is an improvement of 67% in acetabular depth ratio if they compare within the group in pre-operative and post-operative hips. Speaking about the center edge of the angle, which was significant difference in Pemberton group, and the mean surface area of femoral head ossified nucleus was significantly improved in Pemberton osteotomy. They give the explanation of this improvement because the age of the patient when they operate on Pemberton was less as compared to the Deca osteotomy. That's why they have the more surface area in the long-term follow-up. In the Reimer index, again, the Pemberton show the 30% or 30% on average, and in Deca osteotomy, the Reimer index average is 36%. In a surgical outcome assessment, all the hips are showing the good normal hip development on the follow-up, but two cases from each in Pemberton and Deca show some dysplastic changes at the final follow-up. In a avian complication rate, one cases were noticed in Deca and Pemberton osteotomy, but they follow the patient for a brief period of the time. They don't have a long-term follow-up, how the patient behave in a long-term follow-up for 4 to 5 years. In a discussion, they compare the paper with some previous paper and the parameters. Like in JBGS British 2004, a paper by Albiana, they show the acetabular index greater than 35 degree in post-op 2 to 3 years. They show the risk of dysplastic hip or subluxated hip development. Novas et al. Mentioned that the acetabular depth ratio between 24 to 28 millimeter is show the between the age 4 to 8 is normal. The development rate of femoral ossified nucleus on dysplastic side was faster than the healthier side after hip reduction. They are specifically mentioned in this paper. They also mentioned there was also one paper by in 2012. They're showing that the Degas osteotomy before the 4 years show the more complication because of the thinness of the iliac bone. In a conclusion, they told about that the early acetabular procedure are recommended for the better development of the acetabulum in near future. The limitation of this study as the only one surgeon is involved in the study, and how they measure the surface area of the femoral ossified nucleus, because for measuring the femoral head ossified nucleus we need a 3D dimension of the femoral head, but they only measure from the 2D only from the X-ray. Age group is not uniform because Pemberton has a smaller age group and the Degas has a older age group, and how even will behave in a long-term follow-up, they didn't mention about it. In implication practice, age of the patient and the timing, we can consider it that if the child is presented to early ages with the walking digits, we can go for the Pemberton, as this paper is showing that the surface area and the acetabular remodeling are good in the Pemberton osteotomy. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so the first of all, Chinmay, it was very nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
And I mean, the person, I have read this paper, but the person who has not read the paper, they will come to have the test of paper through your presentation. So I'm very happy the way you presented. That is first thing.
Thank you, sir.
Now, I want to ask a question that the average age of patients who had undergone Pemberton
Yes, sir.
was 54 months, and average, that's fine, you don't need to go through it. And the average age of patients where Dega was done was 83 months. So does, through reading this paper, you think that the surgeon thinks that Dega gives more coverage or more correction than Pemberton? Why he, and on what basis he chose Dega over Pemberton, or vice versa?
They didn't mention any specific criteria that we are going for the Dega or we are going for the Pemberton, but when I go for the sub paper, I think that Dega has a more bigger femoral head, which will go the acetabulum, more chance of remodel in the future. I think so, but sir, I didn't
Okay.
anything.
So that we can communicate with the author that how you chose a Dega over Pemberton. Now I'll ask, Mandar is here, so I'll ask Mandar first of all. How in your practice, I have been doing all Dega for all the cases, all older children. How Pemberton is different than Dega in terms of giving coverage, or how would you choose between this if you do, if you have to choose? And then you can talk about this paper,
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. The most of the osteotomies which we do currently are some form of Dega. Now, exactly what is a Dega is slightly lost in the translation from the old literature to what exactly the English literature has interpreted. But what we do is a form of Dega where there is a curvilinear cut which goes about 2/3 of the way posteriorly and does not involve the posterior column. So that is what the Dega concept we have, with the medial cortex completely intact. Now, 99.9% of all the osteotomies which we do are Dega in my practice. I don't remember when I have done something like a Pemberton. So I have done something like a Pemberton purposefully. Sometimes what happens is that the medial cut becomes complete, and then we say, "Arey, aaj ye Pemberton jaisa ho gaya." So it's almost like something which
inadvertent osteotomy.
Pembertonish kind of osteotomy. I've never done a Pemberton purposefully, to be frank. Coming to this paper, I sometimes feel some papers, I sometimes wonder how some papers get accepted. This paper, there's no differentiation about why one person has done a Pemberton versus why that same person has done a Dega. He has done it at, one is at 54 months, the second is at around 7 years, yes, 86 months or something. Again, that is quite an upper limit for doing a Dega in terms of closure of the triradiate at around that age. So I don't know. So what is the highest age that they have done a Dega in?
Chinmay?
The range, so range is up to 83 months.
No, that is the average.
So they go for the 94 months, 92, 94 months.
almost, yeah. So almost 8 9 years. Yeah, again, it's quite a old age for doing a Dega. I don't know what is the logic behind their choosing a particular osteotomy for that particular patient. So if you look at the range of doing a Pemberton is say 54 and plus or minus probably a year here and there, and Dega also if it is 83 plus or minus a year, there will be a lot of overlap between at around say 5 6 years where they will have to choose on table between doing a Dega versus a Pemberton. Again, I don't know how they have chosen that. I don't think that this article per se is going to change our practice because we are probably set in how we do it. We are comfortable with doing a Dega, and that's it. So
Yeah.
Dr. Jayant, what do you feel about it?
So I'm a Pemberton man. I think I'm the only um, senior Indian surgeon who does Pemberton. And your comment is very interesting because when I asked Peter Stevens when he would do a Salter, he said the same thing, and never knowingly. Um, so Pemberton originally designed his operation for the Navajo Indians um, who would come to Salt Lake City with DDH. As you know, that famous picture is there of the Navajo Indians swaddling their babies. They have the highest incidence in the world of any ethnic group, 171 per thousand live births. That is the reported rate of DDH in Navajo Indians. And his hospital was next to the biggest Navajo reservation in the US. So all of those patients came to his hospital. So he had to do one operation without any fixation, just did a single operation and they wouldn't even come for spica removal. So you have to remember why he did the operation that he did. And the reason he did his operation is because he had no C-arm. In those days, there were no C-arm. So you could not go from lateral to medial because if without C-arm, if you breach the medial wall, something bad could happen. So he went from front to back because then he thought, okay, he was a little safer. So, it's not a direct competition between operations because Dega did his operation for his reasons, and Pemberton, they all evolved these operations over a period of time to suit their particular conditions, right? So we can't, and your comments are very correct in that, it's not fair on Pemberton or it's not fair on you. So you are doing the operations for your time. You have C-arm and you have all the things, and since then we have a lot of new knowledge about anterolateral dysplasia and posterolateral dysplasia, lateral dysplasia. So I use both operations. I'm comfortable with the Dega and a Pemberton, and I assess the intra-op cover. Where do I need the most cover? In which position is the hip most stable? And I would put my graft there. So I don't think I think it's unfair to compare a Pemberton with a Dega. I don't think the younger surgeons in the group should be dogmatic about which operation they want to do. They should be comfortable with both operations. Both operations have a place in the management of DDH. And if you have both of these tools in your armamentarium, I think you're a better surgeon because then you can respond to the situation as appropriate. I think that's my take on.
Yeah.
Dr. Jain, on table, when will you choose to do a Pemberton versus when will you choose to do a Dega? So probably that surgeon is probably the same mindset. He may be comfortable with doing both. So on table, he has not explained about when he has chosen a Dega versus a Pemberton. So how will you do
Absolutely, absolutely. So those are the things that need to come out. They are not, in my opinion, they are not comparable operations. You do them in completely different situations. And again, looking at the reason they got a poor centrage angle, less centrage angle with a Pemberton, is Pemberton is an operation that's at 45 degrees to the cardinal plane. So if you take an AP pelvis X-ray, you will always get less centrage angle with a Pemberton because the osteotomy itself is in a different plane. So you have to do like a false profile view. So you have to do an iliac oblique view at 45 degrees in order to see the maximum coverage that you get in the Pemberton. So before I do the osteotomy, after reduction of the head, I will actually see what is the position of least stability. So if the position of least stability is anterolateral, then I would do a Pemberton. And if the position of least stability is lateral or posterolateral, then I would do a Dega. And I do that before and even after doing a Dega, sometimes if I get a little anterior instability, I would put the graft a little bit more anteriorly. And I'm sure you do that as well, Manda, about where you position the graft. So we have all these little subtle,
Variation.
tricks of the trade that we use all the time. Sometimes even we don't realize that we are doing it. Your fellow kind of points it out to you. So these are all techniques that we evolve. Which so I don't think this is not a good paper because they are comparing
Yeah.
in my experience because they are comparing apples and pears. You can't do that.
So maybe there is a very popular radio jockey in Ahmedabad, and he gives Mirchi to the all new movie review. So maybe my fellows can give Mirchi to all the papers, from grade from 1 to 5, and my experts can say whether they graded it. So both these papers today, I will give 1 Mirchi. Okay. Now, one just small comment is that in early days of my practice, when I came back from sick kids, I was doing a lot of Salter osteotomies, and there I saw quite a good remodeling, and the X-ray would look more normalish compared to when I used to do Dega. Dega is very straightforward and very kind of easy procedure compared to Salter, passing your Gigliso wire and cutting it right straight and then putting wires. And in Dega, we did not have to come back for removal of wires, so there's one less procedure. And then I have assisted Prasad for a few times, and for a single incision, safe surgical dislocation, and lateral incision Dega, where I could see how this Dega works, how it covers the hip. And what I found that with Dega, we have more lateral coverage. Even though we say that we put more graft anteriorly, again, it's not as good anterior coverage, anterolateral coverage as we have in a Salter or in Pemberton, because you are kind of cutting the inner cortex completely. So your take on that? I mean, we have not opened and seen, but I could see this when Prasad was doing all lateral open approach, where you can really see how the acetabulum is coming down. But this is just my observation. We can discuss it further later. We have sort of time. Thanks, Jain. Maybe we may have a journal club or something on hip, and Mandar can come back and teach us more. Okay, so Chinmay, now Shalin, can you share your paper?
Yes.
So nice reading, nice review, Chinmay. Congratulations. So Shalin is another fellow, and is a young budding. He's back from honeymoon, so he knows how to deal with gentle ones. So Shalin, this is again a gentle paper. Go ahead.
So this is an open reduction versus in situ fixation of neglected lateral condyle fractures, a comparative study between two techniques. It's a paper published in JPOB March 2018, presented by two surgeons from MC Delhi. This is one of the for neglected or non-union cases of lateral condyle, the condition of pseudoarthrosis due to the extreme rotation and displacement of the condylar fragment, which was mentioned by Wilson in 1936 in his paper. So this is the rough journey of our protocols for lateral condyle, missed lateral condyle fracture or neglected lateral condyle fractures over the years. Initially, excision of the fragment was carried out, then cuneiform osteotomy, and then just the management of the valgus deformity. And later on, Mercer-Rang in his paper suggested just anterior transposition of the ulnar nerve and forgetting the non-union. Recently, functional reduction of the late presentation of the non-union was indicated, and in recent papers, open reduction internal fixation, anatomical fixation had been stressed, where one paper by Park in 2015 suggested in situ fixation without bone grafting, which was a retrospective study. So in this study, two methods are compared. One is open reduction and an attempt to anatomical reduction and fixation, and the other technique is in situ fixation, and bone graft is used in both of the techniques. So more than at least 3-month-old lateral condyle fractures were included, and without any initial operation. And any initial surgical operation or a high highly valgus elbow, which would require a supracondylar osteotomy. Those were excluded. In preoperative assessment, they assessed the range of motion and Liverpool elbow score. Preoperative and postoperative were measured. Presenting complaint were measured. Radiographic assessment for displacement and non-union. And they tried to give a Milch classification for each of the non-union cases. Posterolateral instability was assessed and nerve status was assessed. They distributed into the two groups by randomization. Group 1, in situ fixation and bone grafting, PEG type from the ulna was used. And in group 2, anatomical reduction and fixation with similarly metaphyseal bone graft from the ulna was used. So this is in this technique, ulnar PEG grafting where in situ fixation has been done. And in this, there has been open reduction and fixation. They used K-wires in smaller children and screw fixation in elder children. So post-operative protocol was 6 weeks of plaster, and at 6 to 12 weeks, intermittent range of motion physiotherapy, continuous passive motion, and night splinting was done. And at 12 weeks, splinting was stopped and screw or K-wire were removed under local anesthesia. Results: there were 45 patients in the study with 23 of in situ fixation and 22 of anatomical reduction fixation. Both groups had no significant difference in their epidemiological distribution. The classification, the age distribution, the age of presentation, all were similar in both the groups with no significant difference. The mean follow-up was at least 5.6 years. This was the comparable results in both the groups. There was no progression of deformity in either group with either of the technique. The significant difference was fishtail deformity was observed in 5 cases in anatomical reduction, where only 2 cases in situ fixation. There was 1 case of osteonecrosis of lateral condyle in the anatomical and none in situ group. Surgical duration was significantly less in the open reduction group, and so were the postoperative complications. 3 cases in anatomical reduction group developed infection with none in the in situ group. Liverpool elbow score in anatomical reduction group was 7.4 compared with 8.7 for the in situ group. Post-operative range of motion at 1 year either remained same or decreased in the anatomical reduction group, whereas range of motion in situ fixation group decreased only in 1 patient, remained the same for 8 patients, and increased by a minimum of 20 degree in the remaining 13 patients. The limitation of the in situ fixation group were lateral condyle prominence, which was present in 4 cases in anatomical group, but 7 cases in situ fixation group. However, they mentioned that the patient did not ultimately complain of the prominence. There was only 1 case of non-union in the anatomical reduction group. However, there were 5 cases of radiological non-union, but they were not symptomatic. It is one of the largest study population, 45 cases. It has a good follow-up of up to 6 years, average of 6 years with range up to 8 years. Cases as well as controls are available, so comparison of 2 techniques is possible, and there is a good matching of both the groups. However, they have removed the implants, screws as well as K-wires under local anesthesia at 12 weeks. They have kept the K-wires for 12 weeks with physiotherapy starting at 6 weeks with just night splinting, which would be difficult in children. And they have used bone graft in both the groups, which has not been mentioned in the initial study by Park, where they have just done in situ fixation without any assistant bone graft. So in situ fixation, as they have said, can be a standard practice for late presenting cases with proper explanation of the prognosis that lateral bump and a radiological non-union might be possible, but without any symptoms, and maintaining the expectations of patients' parents.
Yeah, so Shalin, nice. First of all, about your presentation. So it's a nice way of presentation, a summary of what was going on in the literature. So that was a nice way to build the background, and then you presented well. 2 things I would suggest: the font in your slide should be a bit bigger, less crowded. So the general population who is reading this through, they should have taste of paper when you present it. And the comparisons which you did through lines, you can also do through tables, which Chinmay did, the way he did, although it was very clear. Now, one limitation of this paper, I found that they classified all the fractures based on Milch 1 and 2. Now, Milch 1 and 2, we know that that shows the entry and exit point of fracture, but it does not mean that whether the fragment was rotated or completely flipped, that we come to know from Jacob or a new a song classification. We know that general orthopedic colleagues, they are not well aware about these recent papers, but the classification of those fracture morphology through this classification would give us idea, about this. Now, the technique, they are putting pegs. I don't know how that putting pegs are helpful, but I remember Dr. Sandeep Patwardhan from Pune, whenever he would do a in situ fixation, he would open. It's not percutaneous fixation. He would open and he would kind of chisel the metaphysis part and the lateral condyle part to induce a bridge union, and then we have to tell all the families that whenever we do lateral condyle fixation, there might be some lateral bump because of the periosteal new bone formation. And we had recent discussion in one of the meetings by Dr. Taral, and he talked about how he would manage lateral condyle, and he mentioned that a flipped, completely 180-degree flipped lateral condyle would need open reduction at any point in time. See, even though we try and open reduction, because of the resorption of the metaphysis and the fracture surfaces, we cannot reduce it anatomically. There would be some disparity. So this is very important point. Now, if there is a completely flipped fracture, even you have to open, then and then only it will give a good range of motion. Otherwise, it will remain stiff. So I think that is the only limitation I see in this paper, that they have not mentioned about the rotation of the fragment. Yes, Mandar, your comment on this paper and how Shalin read this paper.
Yeah, so excellently done. I agree with Maulin about slightly increasing the size of the font and probably making your slides slightly less busy in some of the slides. But otherwise, excellently done, and you have reviewed the paper quite well. Regarding the paper itself, again, we have many papers about this sort of in situ fixation. I think there is a paper from Sick Kids where they had described in situ fixation for late presenting lateral condyles. But all of them were if you look at the Finn-Bogason classification or the Song classification, so Finn-Bogason type 2 or the Song type 3 or 4, the rotated fragments and neglected, I feel that it is quite difficult to do just an in situ fixation. So if you have a rotated fragment, I have failed to see how just an in situ fixation will work. In situ fixation, if you look at the X-rays which they have said, they have shared, the in situ fixation ones, they are only the type 3 or 4 songs where they have just gone up, they have not rotated. In all the rotated fragments, I think by instinct one has to do an open reduction. Otherwise, it's difficult to do just an in situ fixation in displaced rotated fragments. So again, I feel that in a lateral condyle, like in most of the cases, we have to do what works best in our hands. Just for the sake of doing an in situ fixation, I don't think that we should go for an in situ fixation, even though the results may be comparable. I think if it's a displaced and rotated fragment, I think we should go for some form of open reduction. It may not be a complete perfect reduction. Probably try to attain a good metaphyseal column strength by putting a peg graph or doing some shingling like Dr. Patwardhan does. But have something which restores anatomy at least partially in rotated fragments.
Yeah. So thanks, Jayant. Your comments?
No, I think we've discussed this paper enough. Nothing further to add.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's true. And as these authors are from India, Shalin, you can ask them whether they had any such flipped and rotated, neglected lateral condyle, and whether they have tried an close reduction for those. Now, not close reduction, but in situ fixation. And if they can share their experience, that will be good. This is basically a pediatric orthopedic paper done by a general orthopedic trauma unit. Fine. Can you stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine?
Yes.
Or I can do mine. Let me see. Now, where is mine paper? So let me. Ah, okay. Okay, so can you see the screen and can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So now this is the title of the paper, Treatment of Subperiosteal Abscess in Children. Is drainage of the intramedullary canal required? And when I saw this title, I felt like this, what the fuck, why this paper, I mean, why this question should be studied? I felt like Kohli. Is there a point? Because we know from the time immortal that Troita, in his epic paper in 1959, he studied the pathogenesis of acute hematogenous osteomyelitis through a clinical and vascular study. and he, Troita is considered as god of pathogenesis of osteomyelitis, like Sachin. And we know the pathogenesis, it is kind of injected in our blood, that the infection starts from the metaphysis of a bone due to sluggish flow in the sinusoids, and it can spread into any direction, but it has a propensity to go through the cortex through small channels into the subperiosteal region. And if it remains untreated, it would spread through the the panosseous thing, and if it remains untreated further, it would devitalize the underlying bone, leading to sequestrum formation. So now these are the slides given by Dr. Dhiren Ganjwala. So I thank to him. So now we know this pathophysiology, and we know that this is all metaphysial beginning. And after Sachin came this fellow, a fellow from small town, and Mahendra Singh Dhoni. Uh, he is a cool man from a small center, and he questioned the conventional thinking. So what he questioned, this is the paper. This paper was published in Orthopedics and Traumatology, Surgery and Research in 2010. And they said the pathogenesis revisited. Now I saw that this paper was from some country which I did not know about. This is from New Caledonia. It's a small island country in South Pacific Ocean, neighboring to Australia and New Zealand. A small country, but with a very robust ID and orthopedic department. And how did they study this? This is a must-read paper for all the fellows and all colleagues, I must tell you that. So they had 450 patients over 20 years, and they termed that acute osteomyelitis originates from the osteoperiosteal area and not the metaphysis. And 60% of their patients had a direct blunt trauma on the affected bone. And they mentions that the better term would be an osteoperiostitis rather than osteomyelitis. So, and they had logical reasoning. If you go through the paper, I will share some of them. And they said that they tend to do ultrasound on emergency department whenever a patient comes with a symptom. It's a small country, small limited center, so patients would come to them directly, and they would do USG uh, in all the patients, and they found subperiosteal collection on day 1 to day 3 of symptoms. And they say if we follow the Troita's theory, a subperiosteal collection would come not as early as day 1 to 3. So it is too early for Troita's theory. So that is the one contra comment by them. The second thing is, they mentions that if we see the histopathology of bone, there are vertical Haversian canals, and then there are horizontal canals which enters into cortex, and then it enters into the subperiosteal region. Now, why the pus trickles into the subperiosteal space through a thick cortex and not going through the vertical Howardsian canals into diaphysis where there is less resistance of penetration. So that was again a valid question. The third is why the whole metaphysis is affected and the nearby growth plates are not affected in most of our cases in longer term follow-up, and some of them they are showing increased growth. So that was again their comment. And the final comment is they mentioned why frank pus does not drain when we make a window in the metaphysis while the subperiosteal area is full of pus. We always see some edematous marrow and sometimes very dirty marrow, but not frank pus, while we see frank pus in subperiosteal region. So because of this and few more reasons, they think that the primary focus of infection is the osteoperiosteal area and not the metaphysis. So how they treated their patients and what were the results? They gave IV antibiotics if there is only small collection on ultrasound, and they drained the subperiosteal abscess if there is more severe collection. Now that was a problem. They did not define what is severe and what is mild. It was just based on the radiologist's opinion. They decided that. But the key thing is they did not do medullary decompression any of their patients. So they never made a window in cortex. And they mentions that acute osteomyelitis is resolved without changes of chronic osteomyelitis and all. So again, I found that discussion is pretty less in the paper. The key difference is these population in the island country, they have done a genetic study that they are resistant to MRSA infection. They did not find any toxic genes or any PVL secreting genes in their patients. Although the neighboring countries like Australia and New Zealand, they are reporting high rates of MRSA, none of these patients developed MRSA. And so these infections were little less severe compared to, now we all have higher increasing rates of MRSA osteomyelitis. So that was the one difference. Now coming to this paper, now I'm coming to the paper. So when I read all these different papers, now I realize the importance of this paper. So they tried to check the theory suggested by this new Kalodina paper. So this was published in JPOB 2016, retrospective study, 68 patients over 9 years. 38 patients had only subperiosteal drainage, while 30 patients had subperiosteal as well as intramedullary drainage. Total 127 patients. And in 127 patients, they chose or included only those patients who had subperiosteal abscess without overt intramedullary changes. How I read between lines that those patients who have very noticeable intramedullary abscess or significant marrow edema, so they excluded, and they think that this is an extensive disease, so you have to do decompression. But they chose 68 patients. They got MRI of all, and they chose 68 patients where there was subperiosteal abscess without any overt intramedullary changes. So now this is again a limitation of this paper because they do not define what is without overt intramedullary change. Is it just an edema in the marrow? There is so that's a key thing of paper, and this is missing. And over 8 years, different surgeons decided the choice of treatment based on their experience. That's another thing. Results, average age of patients is 7 years. Now here, unlike in this previous paper, 55% patients had affected from MRSA. So these are more severe sort of infection. And as we know, the femur and tibia were the common affection. They found that in only subperiosteal drainage group, 12 out of 38 required a repeat operation, while on subperiosteal with intramedullary decompression, only 2 out of 30 required repeat operation. So this was a significant difference. Now they also thought about the MRSA part, and 35 out of 68 patients had MRSA as causative organism, and then they subdivided. So in subperiosteal drainage group, 23 had MRSA and 12 required repeat surgery, while in intramedullary decompression, there were 12 MRSA and only 1 required repeat surgery. So they conclude that only subperiosteal decompression done, there are 6 times higher chance that patient will return to operation theater. So you do intramedullary drainage along with subperiosteal drainage in all your patients, because we do not know which patients would have MRSA as a causative organism unless you have done blood culture before. So they recommended that the theory is suggested by the previous paper from New Caledonia, it does not hold true, because their population of infection causative organism is entirely different than what is existing in the world. So now this paper also has a lot of limitations, and the first thing, they have not defined what is meaning of subperiosteal collection without overt medullary changes. We may have to communicate with the authors personally. Now different surgeons perform different operations according to their wisdom. Like someone did multiple drill holes, someone made a medullary window, someone put a scoop in, or someone followed my technique. So all the surgeons have done different technique, and so we don't know. There was no harmony of, or there was no uniformity of surgical intervention. We also do not know the results of good results in one group is due to the less number of severe organism like MRSA. So that point needs more discussion. And it's a very small study group, multiple variables. So a logistic regression model cannot be applicable to this paper. So these are the limitation. I'll give 2 mirchi out of 5 to this paper, but at least I'm thankful to Chinmay to bring this paper in notice so that I could read the Troitas paper fully, and then to the new, see, I cannot pronounce the name of that country, but that paper from near New Zealand. So it gave me an insight of this pathophysiology again. Thank you. This is a must paper for everyone to read, but it does not change our practice. Ultimately, you know, as Dhoni said once, Sachin is my role model. So we have come back to Sachin, and we have to continue the same practice of doing intramedullary decompression. When it's just a metaphyseal disease, you may make a window and do the local scoop. If it's an extensive disease, you have to use something like a giggly saw, the technique which we have found. And maybe, as Jayant told me yesterday, that might get published in our next paper from International Journal of Pediatric Orthopedics. So thank you very much. Yes, Mandar, your comments on this paper.
Yeah, I think you have very nicely summarized everything, including the history of management of acute osteomyelitis. In fact, I agree with your conclusions that we finally go back to the old school, where we really need to do intramedullary decompression just to be on the safe side. So I think you have summed up everything. Perfect.
Yes, Jayant, any comment from your side?
No, Moulin, you've done a really great job. I've learned a lot actually with your historical review. That's very good. With Trueta and all that. Excellent.
Yeah, so I would advise my fellows, I'll share those papers. They're nice papers. We should there are some epic papers. We should read Salter's Innominate paper, and there are some great papers. Anyways, so with this, we'll conclude the paper presentations. Thank you very much. And now I'll invite Mandar for taking us through his talk and a pearl of wisdom to young fellows, how to write your first paper. And please, Mandar, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Moulin, for inviting me for this talk. Now, this is something which is very close to my heart, publishing your first paper. Most of us who have had a few publications know that getting the right subject for.
So Mandar, before you go ahead, as many people joined later, Mandar is now currently the main reviewer and editor of pediatric orthopedic part of Indian Journal of Orthopedics. And he is a very busy doing that job, and he has really made it very quick response for publication. So thanks, Mandar, for that labor you are taking.
Thank you.
And it's our pleasure and fortune that you are here to guide our fellows. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Moulin. So as with most of us, our first paper is something which we really like to brag about or remember about. And when I look back, sorry. Yeah. So the first, so why do you want to publish your first paper? Many times what happens is that it's always, we feel that what we have done as a thesis is something which is groundbreaking, or we want to add something to your CV, or we want to impress our boss. Whatever it may be, our first article is something which is very close to our heart. Even if it's quite silly, like my son was doing something silly, we find it very, very interesting to look at it later on. And our first article is not just one. Usually we try to work on many similar articles, many articles at the first time. I think there is something wrong with my presentation. I'll just stop and do it again.
Yeah.
Just one second.
You're gradually looking like Virat Kohli, Mandar. So in Mumbai, you are saving time by not shaving.
Yeah,
Oh, is a style.
अभी थोड़ा style करना है.
Good.
Sorry.
He's trying to look a little older than he is.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a problem with having youthful good looks.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to look as old as I am rather than quite young than what I am. So anyway, so the important thing to remember is that before all this, there are a number of rejections like this. So what do we do for all this? I remember, Malin, do you have the, okay. So there was this very famous series, The Sacred Games. And when I look at it, and there was this famous dialogue about Apun ke teen baap the. So in my publishing journey, there were 3 baps of mine. There were 3 mentors. One of my first bosses, Dr. Subhranshu Mohanty, who is currently the Bombay Orthopedic Society president. Dr. Alric Arujis, who taught me in Wadia, and Dr. Mukund Datte, who is a very famous plastic surgeon and brachial plexus surgeon at Wadia. So these were my 3 mentors in my publishing journey, and they gave me 10 tips over the many years in trying to publish, and gave me these 10 pearls of wisdom. So let's go to the first one. Are you able to see this, or
this slide got blurred.
I know.
So,
anyway, so what I'll do is I'll just do this. I think this you are able to see.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry for that. There's some issue with it.
Can you close that click to add notes thing, and it will become a little bigger? Yeah. Can you close this? Yeah. This is fun. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah. So the first thing what Dr. Alric said is always prepare more than one publication. First publication, which means that don't try to put all your eggs in one basket. When you are working as a fellow, ask your boss, sir, give me something more to work on. Don't just try to make just one publication, because if it gets stuck, then you are nowhere. So always try to prepare more than one first publication. The second is what Dr. Mohanty told me. Be proud of your own innovations. So what he did was, he's a joint replacement surgeon, and he had made this very famous indigenous template, which is now available commercially also. About 12 years back, he had just started making this, and he was very proud of this indigenously made template for making a spacer for infected THRs. So what we did was, we studied all his series, and this was the thing which we had published long time back. So outcome of THR as a salvage procedure. So we Indians are quite zugadu, and we should be proud of our own zugad and try to publish all these zugads, and they really have a good audience for them. So be proud of your own innovations. The next is what Dr. Thatte said, think of technical tips or technical notes. So there are a few articles, few journals which publish these technical tips or surgical steps or notes. In fact, there is a full journal which is a very high-end journal known as Techniques in Hand and Upper Extremity Surgery. Now, Dr. Thatte does his brachial plexus explorations with a different technique, with a V-shaped incision. And this is what we had asked our artist, who in fact was a colleague, plastic surgeon, to draw these surgical steps. And then it became a very famous article on approach to supra and infraclavicular part aspects of the brachial plexus, which was published in this journal, Techniques in Hand and Upper Extremity Surgery. So there are a few of these journals which publish just these techniques, and they, even if you don't have a big series, if you have a unique technique which your boss is doing, I think that is something which can be published relatively easily. What Dr. Aldrich used to always say is that reviewers are your friends, and start at the top of the food chain in terms of journals. So what does that mean? We always think that we should be able to get a quick publication. So start with a sort of local journal or something of that sort. But what the foreign publications they have got excellent reviewers. In fact, we also have excellent reviewers, but the level of reviews there are at a different level itself. So if you send an article to CORR, you get a review which is like this, almost as big as my discussion. So it's a very in-depth review which you get. And even if the article gets rejected, if you use the points in the reviewer's comments, you will be able to make a much better publication, so that the next time you send it to a journal, it has a very high chance of getting accepted. Dr. Mohanty always used to say, no one is interested in the 51st case. So what does that mean? So sometimes when you're in the OPD, in a busy clinical OPD, and you see some unique case, and your boss says, "Arey, kya unique case hai? Iska case report likhte." So I remember this case. This case I had seen in 2008 when I was a fellow in KEM, and this was something which was very unique. You could see that all the carpal bones were lysed, the tarsal bones were also almost completely lysed. He had severe joint deformities, and we researched, and this was something known as carpal tarsal osteolysis syndrome. And we researched and we said, oh, only 50 cases have been reported in literature. I thought, I think this should get published. And this article has got rejected, and this article still has not got published. Because as he said, no one is interested in the 51st case. Though we know that there are only about 50 cases reported, no one is interested in adding one more of the rare case. But there is a corollary to it, is that no one is interested in the 51st case unless it is slightly different than the previous 50. So in case you want to, I as an editor, if I see a case report, I don't see it as that it should be rare or something. Even in that rare aspect, there should be something which is slightly different than what has been already published. So there is one thing which always we see, whether it is adding something to the literature, or is there any different aspect which is seen in the literature. So this is one thing which I saw in Wadia. This was something known as Lowe's-Dietz syndrome, where he is a combination of hyperlaxity but with contractures. So you have ligament laxity, you have bifid uvula. But what was all these features had been described, but what was not described is this, that is bilateral radial head dislocation. So radial joint dislocations were something which were not described in Lowe's-Dietz syndrome. And that is what we eventually got it to be published as a different aspect of the same syndrome. So Lowe's-Dietz syndrome with bilateral radial head dislocations was what we published in Journal of Orthopedic Surgery. So always try to find something different in that 51st case of a rare disorder which you are seeing. Dr. Thatte always used to say, either have a small series of a unique subject or a huge series of a common subject. So what does that mean? So brachial plexus palsy is a relatively common thing. And thankfully, when we trained under Dr. Thatte, we had a huge series of almost 150 cases, which we published way back in 2011, which at that time was the second largest series in the world. I'm sure Moulin will be having the biggest series as of now, and will be publishing it soon about it. But at that time, it was the second largest series in the world. And so in a common condition like brachial plexus palsy, you should have something which is really big. Only then does it get accepted. As against that, congenital pseudoarthritis of the tibia, even for pediatric orthopedic surgeons, is not extremely common. It's not very common as in brachial plexus palsy. And that is why we could get an article which is of 15 cases published from my mentor from Korea in Acta Orthodega, again a good journal. And in fact, this was even cited by Dror Pale as one of the first articles about Elizarov and Roding in his article on CPT. So again, even if it's a smallish series of a rare condition, it should be worth publishing. The next thing is for the short-term fellows which we have, or even a year, 1 year fellows, we should not think of the cases which you are seeing at that time. What does that mean? Dr. Alrich used to say most cases of short-term fellows are done of cases operated much before their time. So in most orthopedic journals, there is a minimum fellowship, a minimum follow-up requirement of an year. So if you are seeing a patient in the OPD just operated and you feel that this is a rare case, we should get this published, it's not going to happen in your duration of the fellowship. So what you should do is you should ask your boss, do you have a case which is operated 2 years back, whom we can research and get a publication done? So that's how this was a case which Dr. Alrich had operated about a year back. And I had in fact gone to this child's home somewhere, got his clinical photographs, and got this published in Journal of Orthopedic Trauma. Again, an article which has been cited very often, and in fact, this has been seen many often in our presentations. This is one thing which I always follow. Create a basic structure of the article well beforehand. After that, it is just English and fill in the blanks. What does that mean? I am still a believer of a simple pen and paper. So what I do is I do a literature search and then I write and scribble these things down. So I know I divide my article into a few paragraphs. So this is the article which got published, Safe Surgical Dislocation with Modified Done Osteotomy for Moderate to Severe SIPs, which I got published last year. So this is the way I prepare for it. I just try to take a pen and paper. I write in introduction what all things I'm going to write. In material and method, what are the paragraphs which I'm going to write. Results are what we find. And in discussion, what else I'm going to write. So once I have these paragraphs in my mind, everything is just English and just fill in the blanks. So you should have a basic structure of the entire article in your mind, and only then will you be able to do it very fast. You should know the basic structure just briefly. You should know in introduction, you should write why you did that particular thing. In material and method, you should know how you did that particular thing. In results, what did I find in the study, and in discussion, what does this entire study mean? And lastly, something which is very important is whose research is it anyway? This is especially true for fellows, and this is one thing which Dr. Thatte used to tell me. And in fact, he had published it in Indian Journal of Plastic Surgery, where the question of authorship. And this happens when the fellow starts becoming too invested and finds his research too personal to him. And these were published instances of 3 top institutes in the country, PGI Chandigarh, Tata Memorial Hospital, and the Ganga Hospital, where there were articles which were published and then retracted when the previous fellows had published the boss's work without even acknowledging the boss. So it's always important that even if you are doing the research of that particular case series, it is finally the boss's work, and he has to be the first person involved in that article. Last and not the least, all 3 of them told me, don't be rejected by your failures and rejections. I had 10 consecutive rejections for my first few articles, and all 4 of them have not yet been published right now. But thankfully now my bibliography runs to about 28 to 30 items in PubMed, and I hope to increase it soon. Thank you very much.
So yeah, lovely talk, Mandar, and it was great way to encourage fellows, and I agree 100% with you. And probably I have also followed these steps in my practice, and there's a nice narration, you know. So as we are short of time, we will not discuss much about it, but we'll let Jayant, who is witnessing what you have said. He is editing papers, and he's seeing a lot of youngsters sending their thesis, and so he will teach you briefly how to write a nice paper. Jayant, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we are short of time, so I'll just...
Mandar, nice presentation. I liked it very much. Thank you very much.
Sorry for that PPT. I don't know why it didn't work.
Yeah,
So
but
you
this
guys can
was
see
good.
my
Yes, we can.
screen.
Yeah.
So this is about better language in scientific publications. It's extremely important. I was fortunate to spend 15 years in the UK. So um, better language was kind of drilled into me. When I was first in the UK, I was so bad, my English was so bad that I could not understand the English accent over the phone. So when I spoke to another Englishman over the phone, it just used to be like Swedish to me, like that. So it's something that comes with practice. So if I had to talk to the medical registrar, I would rush to him and watch his lips move. Only then I can understand the new accent. So English is not some God-given gift. Okay, you have to practice it, and it comes over a period of time. So strategy to write a better paper is a well-conducted study results in a well-written paper. You cannot make, flowers out of dung. It's not possible. So you need to have a clear message and ideally a single message. Don't try to do 10 messages in one paper. Make 10 papers out of it. Just a single message that should be very, very clear. And read the full text articles of the entire bibliography, or at least 90% of the bibliography that you mentioned. You should pull out the full papers and read those papers, because that will give you the language, that will give you the overall content for your work. And you have to improve your vocabulary, and I'll give you some tips for that. So use the active voice whenever possible, not something like whenever possible, the active voice should be used. So that's in passive voice, right? So that's the difference between active voice and passive voice. You should always use active voice whenever possible. And you have to write in simple sentences. The commonest mistake that I see in papers written by Indian trainees is just the sentence goes for 5 lines. And by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you've lost the meaning of what the guy was trying to say. So you have to write in simple sentences and cut them down. If it's too long, you can cut it down into 3 or 4 smaller sentences, which are much more easy for the reader. And you get reader fatigue. If you have a complex sentence which you cannot split down into smaller parts because it loses its meaning, punctuate it, put semicolons, put commas, so that when we read it, whenever there's a punctuation mark, our brain stops, and then you consider it, and then for a microsecond, so it makes more sense. It's readable, and that's what reviewers are looking for. Is the first thing they are looking for is the paper, is it a readable paper? Because you don't want to get fatigued by the time you get to the sort of discussion part. And aim not to repeat the same word more than once in a sentence. That's very, very important. And if you see all of the 6 sentences I've written, 5 sentences I've written, not one word is repeated. Yeah, so that's the way to write. You should not repeat the same word in a sentence. So there are lots of good grammar tools in Microsoft Word. There's Thesaurus. I use Thesaurus quite a lot because it gives you equivalent words, and I'll show you some examples. There is a grammar correction tool. Switch it on. The spelling tool is switched on by default, but the grammar tool is not switched on by default. So switch on the grammar tool, and Microsoft Word is a good starting point for you to improve your grammar. It gives you very useful suggestions. And word count is very important. 2,500 words, no more. Nobody wants to read. Even if you've found out the answer to all the problems in the universe, if it's written in more than 2,500 words, no one's interested. So however important your message, brevity, keeping it concise and doing it, it's like a good joke. If it can be sent in one sentence with a short punchline, then that's a really good joke. It should be like that. So I've taken Maulin's article, which he has submitted to the IJPO, as my test case today. And you can see in his background, he said, after a uniform treatment protocol executed at a single center, I thought executed, only convicts and criminals are executed, not studies. So I went to the thesaurus, and then I get a lot of much better words: performed, implemented, effected, completed, accomplished, finished. So I chose implemented. So he implemented a treatment protocol at a single center rather than executed. So thesaurus, I didn't use my brain at all in this. I just went to the thesaurus, and I've got like 15 similar words that I can use, which are more appropriate. And then Maulin, being the sort of guy he is, he also said aggressive. So he did an aggressive and early surgical debridement. So the synonyms of aggressive are violent, hostile, destructive, belligerent, antagonistic, and bellicose. So that kind of summarizes Maulin. I know Maulin Shah, so I know he will use a word like this because that's the sort of guy he is. He's a Virat Kohli, but but that's not the, you don't want these. So I took out the word aggressive, and then I put thorough. So what he has actually done is a thorough debridement. So I changed the word slightly, and the reason I put this up is, why does aggressive look out of place to me? Is because aggressive, as a surgeon, we know what aggressive debridement means. But as a human being, the word aggressive means all of these things, right? So it means violent, hostile. So he did not do a violent debridement. He did not do a hostile debridement or a destructive debridement. His was actually a thorough surgical debridement. So you have to change it. So whenever you read it, and if it doesn't sound right, go to the thesaurus and look for similar terms that actually conveys the meaning you're trying to convey. And this is an example. This is my own edit of a paper. So ORIF has its own demerits, such as, see, I've used the same adjective: greater soft tissue trauma, increased surgical time, longer duration of hospitalization, and higher risk of elbow stiffness postoperatively. So these are all incremental adjectives, right? But you can see how I've used. So I could have said greater soft tissue trauma, greater surgical time, greater duration of hospitalization, and greater risk of elbow stiffness. But then you're using the same word 4 times in the sentence, and that doesn't sound very right. So you can see how I've just played with the English and made the sentence read much better. It just gives you a little bit of variety and just better quality of English. So these are just a few thoughts of mine I had in terms of using better language to write a better paper and hopefully improve your rate of acceptance. Thank you. So that's my opinion as an editor. So these are the sorts of things that Mandar and I try to do when we try to improve the way papers are written. I do a lot of editing myself. Some of it is done by the editorial board, but improving English, that's something I do myself. So anyway, I hope that was useful. Maulin, you're muted.
So this is good, especially for the middle-aged fellows like me. The youngsters, they know all these applications in Microsoft Word, and it's good to have young fellows to guide us every time. But I agree, like we think in our native language, we think in Gujarati, write in English. So sometimes it's
So the other thing I want to show is that I wholeheartedly agree with um, what Mandar. So this is my oblique pinning paper. I don't know if it shows very well. So I sit and write the whole paper out in longhand, just like Mandar does. I have my own little notebook where I write everything, all of my thoughts down. This is with me 24 hours a day. So I sit and write the paper with my own hand. In longhand, I'll sit and write the paper, all the key points I want to cover, and see exactly. So we all do the, people who publish papers, they have certain basic habits. So it's very important to cultivate these habits and start writing. And then you can, transfer those thoughts into typewritten documents. So it's very important to have good regular habits that you follow. And, over a period of time, I think it'll serve you very well.
So I hope today's journal club would help everyone and encourage everyone to write papers. We Indians have huge patients load. We have highest number of patients across the world, but we have to put them systemically, and we'll come out with a very robust and meaningful research. Thanks, Jayant and Mandar, for your time, and thanks everyone from all the corners of India and abroad. Wish you, we'll meet next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Jayant. Take care.